Hi guys, this is Lalit and welcome to DEVFLIX workshop. Today we'll try to rebuild the landing page of landing page of Netflix from scratch without any prior knowledge of HTML and CSS. To clarify things, this workshop is not sponsored by Netflix. We chose Netflix only because they had a simple landing page compared to other popular brands. Now, this is a beginner-friendly workshop. Those who know HTML and CSS, who wants to refresh their front-end skills or just to practice, can code along with me. Or else, if you are an absolute beginner, you can see the step-wise instructions and code in the documentation and our GitHub repo as well. Now, first of all, we need an editor. You can use any IDE if you already have it installed. Now, I'll be using VS Code. You can install VS Code using the link provided in the documentation. Also, after installing, open up your VS Code and let's install some extensions. So extensions are nothing but add-ons or plugins that brings new features like auto formatting code or providing code snippets. For example, there's this extension called Live Server, which we'll see that in use in a moment. But let me first show you how to install it. So you can open the extensions tab by opening this button, and you can search the extension which you want to install. Now we want Live Server, so let me type it here. This is the extension which we want to install, and click install here. Now I already have it installed. Usually it takes only a couple of minutes to install. Great, now our editor is ready. Now also download the zip file which we sent you in a drive link, and this is the drive link. Now I already have it downloaded in this folder. Now you have to unzip it. So this is what our project folder looks like. We have an empty index.html file and an empty CSS file. We don't need these files actually, license and readme. So let me quickly delete them. Okay, and also we have an images folder which contains all the images which we'll be using for this project. Okay, now that we have our project folder ready, now let's have a look at what we'll build today. Okay, so this is the original Netflix landing page, and this is what I built for this workshop. In your Chrome browser, we already have inbuilt tool called as Chrome Developer Tools. It can be opened by right-clicking anywhere on the web page and inspect. So this is a Chrome Developer Tool, and it basically shows you the source code of this web page. This is the HTML code for this website, and its corresponding CSS is shown here. Now, what is HTML and CSS? Both of them are a different kind of programming language when compared to some commonly used languages like C++, Java, or Python, where we have variables, evaluate arithmetic equations or logical expressions, and ultimately the ability to express logic. Now, HTML and CSS aren't much about logic as they are about structure and the aesthetics of a page. HTML defines the content and the structure of a web page, whereas CSS translates the display and design of these HTML elements. For example, this button is created using this line of HTML code. And this is how it would look if we didn't add CSS to this HTML element. Now using CSS, you can give this element a background color, a font size, some padding, remove a default border and a font color, also some border radius to curve the edges. So that's how we use HTML and CSS to style and develop our front end of websites. Now if I change the browser screen size, you can see that the styling of some of the elements are changing along with it. For example, this text element had a bigger font size earlier. Now the font size has decreased. Also, this image element here, which was first at the right side of this container, is now shifted to the bottom of this section. So this is what we call a responsive website. People aren't always looking at their websites on their desktop screens, but also on their mobile phones and tablets as well. So it is really important to design our websites in a responsive way. Okay, so let's start building this site. Here we can see three different sections. The first one is what I'm going to call the header section, which is represented by this highlight thing. Then we have the content section. Then again we have another content section. And at last we have the footer, this one. So let's start building with the simplest section, which is the content section. Also, we'll start from the mobile view and then make this content section responsive for larger screen sizes as well. Now you can view the mobile view of this website by just decreasing the width of your browser. So basically, this is what the website would look if you open this website in a mobile device. And let's say this is how it would look in a tab device. And this is for the desktop view. Let me open up my VS Code. First, you can open your project folder here by going to File, Open Folder, and then navigate to your folder. Now I have my folder inside in my desktop. So select the folder, and now you have opened your project folder in VS Code. Now let me quickly open the index.html and styles.css files. We have two empty HTML and CSS files. Now the name can be anything. It's just a convention to name your first HTML file of a project, or name your HTML file which creates your landing page as index.html. And again, styles.css is just a convention. You can name it anything. Now, first you can get the HTML boilerplate code of creating any HTML website by using this shortcut, which is exclamation followed by enter. Now, this is the boilerplate code for creating a HTML website. Let me explain you briefly what this means. So let's see the general syntax of an HTML element. Now, what is an HTML element? An HTML element describes something in a page. For example, this text element is a HTML element. Also, this image and this button are all HTML elements. All these HTML elements are indicated by what we are going to call a tag, enclosed using those angle brackets over here. So this is the tag name of this particular element. So this is a h1 element. This is what we call a opening tag, and it indicates the start of the contents inside this HTML element. And at the end, we have the closing tag, which marks the end of our contents inside this element. Now there's only one syntax difference between opening and closing tag. The closing tag has a slash before its tag name. Now you might also have something called as attributes inside your opening tag of your HTML element. For example, we have a class attribute here, which defines a meaningful name for this element. So I can use this name, which is title, to style this h1 element later in my CSS code. So we have another attribute here, which is called as style. So you can have any number of attributes for a HTML element. Also, these attributes are not repeated in the closing tag. They are present only inside the opening tag. Now, between the opening and closing tag, we have the actual content which lies inside this element. For example, we have this is a heading text inside this h1 element. So what basically this h1 element does is it displays this text. This is a heading as a text in a website. So this is the general syntax of an HTML element. You can also hover over the tag name to get more information about this element. And also it provides you with the MDN documentation link where you can read more about these elements. For example, we have all the attributes which this element can have. And we also have a code examples and the corresponding outputs. You can learn about more HTML elements by just using this website. Also, I prefer W3 School's website for learning HTML. Next, let's look at boilerplate code. So at the very first, we have something called as the doctype HTML tag. Now this is just a fancy way of saying the browser that this is an HTML5 type document. Next, we have the HTML element. This is the root element of this page. It also has the attribute lang or language with value en or English to specify that this HTML code is written in English language. Now inside this HTML element, we have two child elements. The first child is the head element, and the head is just really the search bar and all the other stuff at the top of the page. Next, we have the body child. The body is like the 99% of user experience, the big rectangular window. Now inside the head element, we can have some meta tags. They provide metadata about our web page. Metadata means data about the data. So they have quite a few attributes like char set or character set specifies the character encoding of the HTML document. We have also this attribute which specifies that the width of our website should be equal to the width of a device, and also the initial zoom or initial scale should be 1 or 100%. We might also have a tag called as title inside our head element. It specifies a name for our page or tab of this HTML code. Now you don't have to remember and type this every single time. That's why we have a shortcut here, which is exclamation followed by enter to get the full boilerplate code. I want you to make some changes along with me. First, let me change the title of this HTML page to DEVFLIX. And then inside a body element, let us have a h1 element that says hello world. Now, in order to run this code, we can use the live server extension which we installed earlier. First, you have to save this file using Ctrl S. Then you can use the go live button, which is present at the bottom right corner of your editor, to run this code. And it will show you how the website would look in a browser in your default browser, which I have Chrome. Now you can see that the title of this tab is changed to DEVFLIX, which we provided in our HTML template. And also we have the h1 element, hello world text inside our body of the page. Now let's say I want to change the color of this text to have a blue color. We can style individual HTML elements using an attribute called as style. Now inside the opening tag of my h1 element, I can use the style attribute, and now inside this quotation marks, I can provide all the CSS properties which I want this h1 element to have. I wanted to change its color to blue, so I can say color, which is a CSS property, and I can define a value by saying color colon and the value which is blue semicolon. So this is the syntax for a CSS property, and you can add CSS properties to the style attribute of any HTML element. Now if I save this, you don't have to start the live server again. It refreshes every time you save it. So we have our hello world text or our h1 element with a blue font color. Now let's say I want to add multiple CSS styling to the same element. Again, I can do that inside my style attribute by just adding some space here. And now I can define the second CSS property here. Let's say I want it to be center aligned. So there's this property called as text align, and I can give this a value center. Now most of the CSS properties are self-explanatory. Now if I save it, you can see that our heading element is center aligned as well. Instead of this, what we can do is we can move the styling information from this element to its parent element. Now for this h1 element, its parent element is the body element. So I can move the styling information to its parent element, and let me add another h1 here. So we have two h1 elements inside our body element, and what this does is if we have some styling properties for our parent element, the same styling information will be applied to all the child elements. So here all these elements which are inside a body element will be styled in the same way. You can see that both our headings have the same styling, which is color blue and center aligned. Now let's say I want to style only my first heading. So what I can do is, again, a simple way of doing this would be just to copy this and put it inside my first heading element, and this works. But instead of doing this, what we call as inline CSS, what we can do is we can move all our styling information to a completely separate file, which is the styles.css file. Now you can style those HTML elements from here itself. For that, first we have to link our CSS file to our index.html file. So you can do that using a tag called as link tag in your head element. So inside a head element, let's add a link tag here. And now the link tag doesn't have a closing tag because it doesn't require any child elements. So we'll just have the opening tag, and it requires two compulsory attributes. The first one is rel or relationship, which specifies which type of file we are linking with. So in this case, we are linking it with a style sheet. So this is okay. Next, we have the href attribute where we have to provide the path or location of the file which we are linking with. My styles.css file and index.html file both are in the same folder. So what I can do is I can just type the name of my file, which is styles.css. Now we have linked our styles.css file with our index.html file. Now I can style those HTML elements from here itself. Let's say I wanted to display all these h1 elements in blue color and also center aligned. So let me quickly remove the styling from here. We haven't applied any styling in our HTML page. We'll do it only in a CSS file. So the general syntax for writing CSS code is, first we'll have a selector, then we'll have a pair of curly brackets inside which you can define CSS properties. So I'll just use a generic term here, which is property, and we'll give this a value. So this is the general syntax for using any CSS styling. The selector will select the HTML element which we want to style, and the property is the CSS property, and we'll assign some value to that. So let me comment this out. You can comment by using control/. Now I wanted to select all my h1 elements, right? I can use the tag name to select all the h1 elements. So I can just say h1 followed by curly brackets. Now I can define the CSS properties which I want to apply to these h1 elements. That is, the color should be blue, and then the text align should be center. So this is the same as saying all my h1 elements should have a color blue and should be center aligned. So if I save this, you can see that all my heading elements are styled. Now let's come back to my question, which is how can I style only my first heading? We cannot use h1 tag here because it styles all the h1 elements. So what we can do is we can use an attribute called as class. Now class is an attribute used to define a meaningful name for any HTML element. So I can basically define a name for this element. Let me call this title like this. Now I can refer to that class name and style it here. I can select all the elements which has that class name. So the basic syntax for selecting all the elements with a particular class name is, instead of just typing the class name, you have to add a dot before it. So it will be dot followed by the class name, which is title. And then you can define all the CSS properties inside this curly brackets. I'll change the color to blue. Now I'll remove the h1 styling, and now you can see that only our first h1 element has the class title, and only our first heading is styled here. So that's how we can use class to style specific elements. Now let's say we didn't apply any CSS properties. Let me remove all this. Now you can see that these HTML properties aren't applied any CSS properties, but they actually have some default CSS properties already. Like for example, this heading element has a default font color which is black, has a default font size, and also has a default property called as margin. Now what is margin? This orange region displays the margin for this element. So basically we use margin to add spacing outside the element. So we have a margin of some value here which is applied to the top and bottom of our hello world element. Now also there are many elements which has some default margin, and I want to get rid of all the default margins. So I can do that by using something called as the all selector. Now the all selector is represented by this asterisk symbol, and what this basically does is it selects all the HTML tags in a web page and defines the CSS properties which are going to give here. And I'll give them a margin of 0. Now what this does is it changes all my default margins to 0. You can see that the margin is no longer here. We got rid of all the orange boxes, and this is how our code looks now. So we use margin to get rid of, sorry, we use the all selector to get rid of all the default margins. Also, let me give a font family. So you can use this property called as font family to define a font for our elements. Now I want all the elements of my web page to have a same font, and I'm going to give it Helvetica font. And also, we don't usually provide with only one font. That is because let's say our browser doesn't have the font size, font family which we are giving. So now all our fonts will have the font Helvetica. If it's not present, it will be sans serif. Now this is how our heading elements will look. We have used the all selector to select all elements, so our H1 elements will also be styled accordingly. Now let us look at our content section, which I'm going to do first. So this is the content section. Let me reduce the browser's width, and this is how the website would look in a mobile device. We have container here, this black container. We have a content section here, and it has two elements. The first one is again a container which has two heading elements inside it, and the second element is an image. So let's code this in our HTML file. Back to my HTML file. Let me remove these headings, and here now we can use something called as div. Now div is an HTML element used to create containers which can contain other HTML elements. So basically it acts like a container of other HTML elements, and inside this we need the two elements which I showed you now. We want another div which will have two heading elements. So let me add two h1 elements here, and outside this div let me give the second child element of this parent div, which is the image. Now this is the tag which you use to display images on a website. Again, image tag doesn't have a closing tag because we cannot give any child elements inside an image tag. And also this image tag requires two compulsory attributes. The first one is src or source, where you have to provide the path or location of the image file. So let me first provide that. Now all our images are inside our images folder. So let me type that, and the image we want is content1.jpg. Now the next attribute is alt or alternate. Now alternate is an attribute which provides an alternate text for our image. So just in case if our image couldn't be loaded in our website, it displays this text instead of the image. So let me just call it section, and let me quickly copy paste these titles inside our h1 elements. I guess that's it. Our HTML structure for our content section is ready. If I save this, this is how our content section looks like. We have two heading elements inside this div. So let's start styling our child elements now. First, let me provide some class name to each of these elements. We'll call this parent div as, let's say, content section. And this div, let me call this content details. Let's call these heading elements title and subtitle. And let's call this image, I don't know, content image. Using these class names, we can style them individually in our styles.css. So in our styles.css file, let me quickly add a comment here that says mobile view, since we are styling the mobile view first, to just simply structure my CSS code here. First of all, let's reduce this image size, which is horribly very big. So we want it to be of this size. So let me first select my image using its class name. Now the class name was content image. So back in my styles file, I can select that class name using dot class name, which is content image, and I can style that image here. Let me give this a width of, let's say, 300 pixels, a fixed value. Now whenever you're giving a fixed value, it should end with px, as in pixels, to indicate that this value is a pixel value. If I save this, we have a smaller image here. I guess this looks okay. But if you look at the deployed side, you can see that if I increase my width of my browser, the width of the image also increases. So basically the width of this image is dynamic. It changes with respect to our width of the browser. So I can give a dynamic value instead of a fixed value by using something called as percentage. Let me say it should have a width of 80%. What basically this does is, now our image will have a width of 80% of the total available width. So this is the total available width, and this image will have 80% value of this. So if I reduce or increase my browser screen size, you can see that the image size also changes with it. So that's how we make element size responsive. Now let's style our parent element, which is the content section. First, we should have a content section of a background color black, and we should also have this gray strip here. Now let me see how we can add it. Back in my CSS file, let me select the parent element, which is content section. Now I'll use the class name, which is content section. Then I can give a background color here of black. Now to create that gray strip, we have a CSS property called as border top. Now as the name suggests, it adds a border to the top of our element. Now border top or any border CSS property requires three values. The first value I'm going to give is width. The second one would be the type of the border, and then the last one would be the color of this border. Now let's say the width should be 8 pixels. Type should be solid. You can also have dotted or dashed types of borders, and the color gray. We have our gray strip over here, but I want to use this particular color. We used extensions like color selector to get the hex value of this particular element. So I already have noted down the color value. So let me give it here. Instead of using some predefined color names, you can also give hex value here. So I'm going to give this a hex value of #222, which is basically that dark gray color. Okay, now our content section is styled. You can see that our heading elements have disappeared because they have the same color as our background color. I have given them a class name of title and subtitle, so I can use that here by saying dot title. First let me give the color here, which is white, and let's say it should have a font size of 28 pixels. Let me copy paste this, and I'll change the class name to subtitle. And also I'll reduce the font size to, let's say, 18 pixels. Now you can see we have some contrasting font sizes here. Also if we look at the deployed side, you can see that the subtitle has a smaller font weight, and also we have some space between the title and the subtitle element, and also some space between the image and the subtitle element, which is not the case here. So we can add some spacing like this outside the element, by using something called as margin. It adds spacing outside around the element. First, let me reduce its font weight to, let's say, 400, and now I can give this a margin value. I'm going to say margin of, let's say, 10 pixels. We have added a margin of 10 pixels outside the four sides of this element. But that's not the case here. We want margin only at the top and bottom of our element. So again, you can do that by, instead of giving one value to a margin property, you can give two values. And the first value will be applied for the top and bottom sides, and the second value will be applied for the left and right sides. So let me change this to 16 pixels. We have applied margin only to the top and bottom sides of our element. All right, now the next change we might have to do is, so you can see that all the elements inside this container are center aligned. So I can again use the text align property to center align all my elements in my parent element, which is the content section. Can use the text align property, and I'm going to say it to be center. Now all our elements or child elements inside this parent container is center aligned. You can see that we have some empty space here around our contents, but that's not present here. We need to add some space above and across all the four sides of these elements. So basically what we want to do is we want to add some spacing inside our content section, so that the elements inside our content section are pushed more towards the center and are not like present towards the edge or top of our screen. So to add spacing inside an element, we can use something called as padding. Now padding works same like margin, only changes, which is margin will apply space outside around the element and padding will add spacing inside the element. So inside my content section, let me give this a padding of, again, let's say 10 pixels or 30 pixels. Now you can see this green region over here is the padding which we applied for this content section element. We have added a padding of 30 pixels from all the four sides of our container. Now again, I want to give two different values, one for top and bottom and other for left and right. So I can do that again by giving two values here. So let my first value be 50 pixels and the second one be 30 pixels. Now we have applied two different paddings here. The top and bottom has a padding of 50 pixels and the left and right padding has a value of 30 pixels. I want the padding applied to the left and right sides to be dynamic. Instead of a fixed value of 30 pixels, I want it to have a dynamic value. So I can go ahead and change here from 30 pixels to, let's say, 5%. Now it still looks the same. What we have done is the padding left and right now takes a value of 5% of the total available width here. So if you increase or decrease the browser's width, the padding also changes accordingly. And I guess that's it. We have styled our content section for a mobile view. Now let's have a look at how this website looks in a tab view. You can do that by increasing the width of your browser. Okay, there are some couple of changes here. First of all, the font size have increased, which is not like this one. And I guess there's no other changes. So yes, so basically we have to change only the font size if the browser size increases beyond the mobile view width. So for this, we can use something called as media queries. Now what is media query? Media query is used to define a separate set of CSS styles based on a logical expression. Now I can have a logical expression, something like if the width of my browser is greater than 500 pixels, I want these separate CSS properties to be applied to my element. So I can do that using media queries. So back in my CSS file, down below, let me add a media query. Now this is the syntax for a media query. Here we'll define a logical expression and all the CSS properties will be present inside this block code. Now let's say I wanted to change the font size, right? So let me select the element using its class name, which is title. So I want this element's font size to increase when the browser's width is beyond a particular value. Let's say 500 pixels. Now we have some basic they are called as breaking points. Now we have some specified values, but today we'll be using some simple values just to keep our code simple. So let's say the design should change to tab view when the width is greater than 500 pixels. So I can define that as a logical expression here by saying only screen and minimum width of 500 pixels. And let me change the font size of my title elements to a higher value, let's say 50 pixels. Now basically what this means is when the width of my browser is at least or greater than 500 pixels, I want these styling information to be applied to my HTML element. Let's test that out. So this is our output window, and if you see that if I increase the width of my browser beyond 500 pixels, you can see that the font size of my title is increasing. So basically that's how we use media queries to style not only font size, we can change any CSS property of any HTML element. So that's what we'll be using today. We'll have two media queries, one for tab and other for desktop, and a set of CSS properties outside media queries which will be applied for mobile view. So let me change the font size of this subtitle element as well inside my media query. I can select the element using its class name, and I'll define it to have a font size of 26 pixels. Earlier it had 18 pixels, now I'm changing it to 26 pixels. You can see that the font size is also increased. So that's how the media query works. Okay, I guess we are done with our tab view as well. Let's have a look at how this website looks in a desktop device. Now we can increase the width even further, and this is how the website would look in a desktop device. Now there are some couple of changes here. First, we have this image shifted to the right side of this text block. Earlier it was below this one, now it's shifted to the right side. And I guess we should also change the padding. We want our elements to be arranged differently. Now we have the child elements, which are this content details div and this image, and they are arranged in a column fashion. Now I want them to change to a row fashion when the width of my browser is greater than some value, let's say 750 pixels. Beyond 750 pixels, we'll have the design for the desktop view. So if you go beyond 750 pixels, I want them to arrange in a row view or row fashion instead of this column fashion. Now we can do that by using something called as flexbox. We can apply the flex property to its parent element or a parent container. Now here the parent container of these two elements is the content section, this one. Now we can apply flex property to this content section, and it basically provides the ability for this parent container to alter the arrangement of its items inside the container. This was the styling for tab view. So let me add a comment here that says tab view. Now let us create another media query for our desktop view. Instead of a minimum width of 500 pixels, let's say 750 pixels. And now this media query will be activated only the screen size is at least or greater than 750 pixels. So first let me select the parent container using its class name, which is content section. I can apply flex to this element using this property called as display, and I can set it to flex. Now I can change the arrangement of the elements inside this container using this property called as flex direction, and I'm going to change it to row. Now if I save this, you can see that the elements are arranged in a row fashion once I go above 750 pixels. We have the first element, which was our content details div, coming to the leftmost of our row, and next we have our image element. Now we can see that the size of our image element is also increased. That's because we gave it a responsive or we gave it a dynamic value of 80%. So since our total available width has also increased, the width of our image also increased. So I guess you understood how to use flex here. We use flex to alter the arrangement of elements inside a container by applying flex to the parent container. Now here let me change the width of my image using its class name, which is content image, and I'll change its width to, earlier it was 80%, now it has a value of 50%. Now we have to change one more thing here. If you look at the deployed side, you can see that the texts are aligned in a left text align property. So I can use that property here again inside my parent container, which is content section. I can change the text align property to left. Earlier it was center, now it will be left. And you can see that our texts are aligned to the left as well. Now we are done with our content section and it's also responsive. So we have another content section here below our first content section. So what I can do is, back in my HTML file, I can copy paste the code which made our content section below the first content section, something like this. Now we have two content sections like this. Now let me quickly change the contents of this content section by copy pasting header elements, and also we need to change the image URL. Now instead of content 1 we'll be using content 2 here, and if I save it, this is how it looks. We have both our sections here, so I didn't have to code again the second content section. You can just copy paste if they have the same styling. But this looks perfect for the mobile view, but the problem occurs when we change it to the desktop view. In our original site, you can see that here in the second content section we have an image in the left side of a container. We want the image to be displayed in the left section, but if I change any part of my code, it will affect this section as well. But this section is perfectly all right. I just want to change this section. Now you can say that I can move this image tag to the top of my content section div, and this works. In the desktop view, the image comes first because in our HTML code we have our image tag first in our content section. So basically this will be displayed first, then the container which displays our heading elements will be displayed. But as soon as I change to mobile view, you can see that the image is getting displayed at the top. That's not the case here, right? We want the image to be bottom for both the sections in our mobile view. So I'll reverse those changes. Now what I can do is, I can give a second class name to this entire content section. Yes, an HTML element can have more than one class names, and all the stylings from each of the class names will be applied to that HTML element. So I can add another or a second class name here just by adding some space after my first class name, and I'll give the second class name, which is let's say reverse. Let me go ahead and style the reverse class here. What we did for the first content section is that we changed the flex direction to row right. That's why our elements are displayed in a row fashion. Now I still want them to be displayed in row fashion, but instead of the first element coming to the leftmost side of my row, I want the last element to be displayed at the left side of my row. So I can change the flex direction property to something called as row reverse. Now this again displays the elements in a row fashion, but instead of displaying the first element as the first element of a row, it displays the last element in our HTML code as the first element of a row. So if I save this, I change it to desktop view, you can see that now our image, which was present as the last element of our content section div, is displayed first here because of the flex direction row reverse. And I guess that's it. We have completed our content section for this Netflix landing page. So this is what I'm calling the header section. This is the header section, and we have two elements inside this. The first one is nav, which is a div, and it has image and a button inside it. And then we have another div or container which has three heading elements. Then we have another div, and it has a input field and a button. So let's create the HTML code for this structure. Back in our index.html file, the header section comes above our content section, so you have to give the structure above our content section. Let me add a comment here, and below this we'll have the code for our header section. Now again you can use a div here, but instead what I'll be doing is I'll use something called as header. Now header is an HTML element. They are also called as semantic elements. They act the same like div. They basically contain other HTML elements, but it is advised to use header instead of div because it helps you structure your code in a more comprehensive way, and also it helps in search engine optimizations. So instead of a div, I'll use a header here, but still structure wise it doesn't make any difference. So inside my header I'll have a div, and this div will have an image followed by a button, and then we have another div here, and it had 3 heading elements. So let me add 3 heading elements here, and then we have another div, and this div had 2 elements. The first one is an input field. In HTML we have this element called as input to create the input field, and it has a compulsory attribute which is type. Now type defines which type of data will be giving this input field as a input value. So now here we want a text type input field. So but you can also have something like a number type or a date type input field. Now let me give another attribute here which is called as placeholder. A placeholder is the text which will be displayed as a label for this input field. I'm going to say email address. Next we have a button. Also we need to add the contents. I didn't provide a source for this one, so my logo is inside the images folder, so I can say images slash logo.png, and the alternate text will be just logo. And also this button will have a label that says sign in. Now first let's add a background image like this for our header element. So back in my CSS file, also we are doing that mobile view first, then we'll go on to other screen sizes. So inside my mobile view section, I'll add a comment for header section, and let me select the element here. Now we'll be using the tag name here because we didn't provide any class name for this header element. Let me give this a background image. Now background image property requires a URL value, and we can provide the URL here which is images slash bg.png, and this is how it looks. The center of our background image and the center of our div is not aligned. I want the background image to also change along with the width of my browser. So I can do that by using this property called as background position, and I can set it to center. The center of my background image and the center of my parent div are aligned. So if you decrease the size, the image will also adjust accordingly, so that we have this Spider-Man guy over here in the center. Also, we can use another property called as background size, and I'll set it to cover. What this basically means is I don't want the scale of my image to change if I change the width or height of my browser. So this will keep the scale fixed, and only the alignment will change of the background image. Now we have our background image. Provide a class name here first, and I'm going to call this logo. So I'm going to call this sign in button. For these 3 heading elements, you can again provide any different class name and again style it. But instead of that, what I can do is, you can see that these headings, this one and this one, are almost similar, right? So we can use the same class name which we used here to apply to this one. And also the styling of this element looks the same as this one. So I'll use the same class name here. Let me call this header details instead, and this will have a class name of email input. And again I can use the same class name which I applied for this sign in button. Class, let me call this nav. Let me change this to email form, and this will be called as header details. So back in my header section, let me select the image using its class name which is logo, and I'm going to provide this a width of 90 pixels. Now next we have to style our button. Again I'll use its class name which is sign in button. Now inside my sign in button class, first let me change its background color. Again you can define red here, but I already have the hex value, so I'm going to give that. Our button is now styled and it has a background color of red. Now also we need to get rid of this default margin. Also we have to provide a color for the font. So back in my CSS file, inside the sign in button, I can give this a color value white, Then let me remove the default border by using this border property, and I'm setting it to 0. Also let me provide some padding, a padding of 4 pixels and 8 pixels for left and right. So this is how our button looks right now. Also we have to curve the edges. So for that we can use something called as border radius, and I can give this a fixed value, let's say 3 pixels. Now you can see that corners are now curved. Okay, so our button is styled and our Netflix logo is also styled. Now if you look at the original site, you can see that we have some spacing between them. I want them to be spaced in such a way that these elements are to the ends of the container, one to the rightmost end and second one to the leftmost end. So again I can do that using flex property to my parent div. So this is my parent div here, and I'm going to apply flex to this element. So I can select nav using dot nav, and then let me apply flex using display property, and I'm giving it a flex value. I'm changing the flex direction to row, and okay, I want these elements to be justified such that the elements are pushed to the ends of the container. So we can use this property called as justify content. As the name suggests, it justifies the content, and I want them to have as much space it can between them. You can see that the elements are pushed to the ends of the container. Now we need to do one more thing, which is we have to provide some padding here so that these elements are not sticking to the corners of our website. So we can provide padding to our nav element. Back in a styles code, inside my nav, what I can say is I can give this a padding of 28 pixels for top and right, and let's say 5% for left and right. We have applied some padding also, and I guess our nav bar is ready for mobile view. Next, also let us align these elements to the center, again using the property which we used earlier, which is text align. So inside my header tag, I can say the text align to be center. Now all my elements are center aligned. Next, we need to add some padding here as well. If you can see here, we have some empty space around these elements, which is not the case here. We need to add some more padding. Here in my CSS file, I can style the header using its class name, which is header details. Now I want to apply some padding here, so I'll use padding, and let's give this a value of 45 pixels for top and bottom, and 5% again for left and right. Now we have a padding also here. Last up, we have to change our styling for our input field and button. I can use the class name, which was email input, and let me give this a fixed height of 46 pixels and a width of 90%. We need some spacing between this button and this input field, and also we need some spacing here so that this placeholder is pushed more towards the center. Now the first spacing is outside the element, so we can use margin here. We are adding some space outside the element, and here we are providing some space inside the email input element, so we can use padding for the second case. So margin bottom adds margin only to the bottom side of our element. I want it to have a value of 10 pixels, and then we need to add some padding to the left side so that this placeholder is pushed more towards the center. I'll use padding left here and give this a value of 10 pixels again. So we have styled our input address field. Now let's increase the size of this button. Now again we have used sign in button class for this button as well. Now we need to add some more styles to this button. So what we can do is we can provide another class name to this element. Inside the class attribute of this button, I can add another class name, something like LG button. And now I can style it here inside my mobile view code. I'll select that element using its class name, and let me give this a fixed height of 40 pixels, and then provide some padding to all the sides. So I'll use the padding property and give a value of 10 pixels. Get started button is also styled, and I guess that's it. We have styled our header section for a mobile view. Let me add a comment here inside the media query for tab view, and here we'll add the styles for the tab view of our header section. Now for the header section, there's not much of difference here. The font size are increased, but it's already taken care of because we're using the same class name. So here also the fonts of these elements will increase. Now the changes we have to do is, you can see that the size of a button increased, which is not the case here. And also we need to add some more padding so that we have some more space here. Let me first select the sign in button, and then let me provide some more padding here. Let's say 7 pixels for top and bottom and 17 pixels for left and right. Now our button size increased because we added some more padding here. Next, let me provide some padding to this parent container, which is header details padding property, and give this a value of let's say 130 pixels for top and bottom and 20% for left and right. So we have some more padding towards left and right side, something like this. We are done with our tab view as well. Let's start styling for the desktop view. First of all, I want this button again in a row fashion. Earlier it was below this input field. Now I want this to come right next against to my email input element. Next, we also have to provide some more padding here. So these are the changes which we need to do. Okay, so first let me apply flex to this container, which is email form, so that now the elements will be aligned in a row fashion. Let me first apply flex to the email form container by doing display flex, and the flex direction should be row now. And this is how it looks. We have a button coming next to our email input field. Next, we need to style our email input field and our button. So I'll use the class name, which is email input, I guess. Yes, and I'll decrease the width. Earlier it was, I guess, 90%. Now let it have a width of 60%. And this is how it looks. Now let's style our get started button using the same LG button class, and we have to increase its size, right? So let me first increase its height to, let's say, 52 pixels. Then I'll also increase the font size. Okay, now our button size is also increased. You can see that we have the curvature still here, but that's not the case in our original website. It should be sharp here. So I can again change the border radius property to 0 now, so that the corners are now sharper. Now let's add some padding here to our header details section. Padding of 130 pixels for top and bottom, and let's say 20% for the left and right side of our element. You can see that this email form element here is not center aligned. We are using flex, right? So inside our email form, I want the contents to be justified to its center. Now you can see that this div gets shifted to the center of our screen. Yeah, so our header section is also done, and it's also responsive for all the three screen sizes. Now let's get started with the head footer section. Now first let's have a look at how the footer section is structured. Now let me first reduce the screen size so that it displays the mobile view of the website. Here I can say that we have three elements inside this footer section. First one is a simple text. Then we have another container here that contains all these heading elements. Then we have another heading element here. So basically this container should have three elements. Again, back in my HTML code, I'll add a comment here for footer section. Again, you can use the div element, but we have this element called as footer. Again, it's same like header. Footer is used to create the footer section of our page. So let me first create the h1 element and copy paste this inside the element, and let me give this a class of, call it footer text. Next we'll have a container or div, and let me call this footer options. Now our last element is again a h1 element. These two heading elements have the same styling, so I can use the same class name. Now I have some 15 heading elements inside our footer options div. I'll use my clipboard Now we have some 15 H1 elements inside our footer options div, and they have a class name of footer link each, and these are its corresponding contents. Oh, sorry, it should be footer text. Now let's save it, and this is how it looks right now. All the heading elements are displayed one below another. So let's first style our footer text elements. Let's do the mobile view first. So below my content section, let me add a comment here for footer section. And here, let me first style the footer text element. I want this to have a font size of 16 pixels. And the color should be, again, I have the hex value. Okay, instead of font size, I gave font. Okay, let me change it to font size. This is how our footer text elements are styled. Now let me also add some margin bottom here so that we have some space between these elements. So back in my footer text, let me give this element a margin bottom value, say 30 pixels. Now we have some margin here and here as well. Now let's style our footer links. They'll have the same stylings, but only the font size will change. It will have a smaller font value. Let's give it 13 pixels. So let me change it to footer link. Okay, something's fishy. Okay, I gave a extra margin here, so let me remove this. But actually we need some margin to space these elements. So what I can do is I can give a smaller margin. Instead of 30 pixels, let this have a margin of 16 pixels. Let's style our footer section, the main container itself. So I can select it using its tag name, which is footer. Let me give this a background color of black, and also we need the gray strip here as well. So I'll use the border property again, border top. The width will be 88 pixels. The type will be solid, and the color should be #222. Okay, so we have styled our footer section. Now if we look at the deployed side, we have some padding here as well. So let's add padding to our footer section. 50 pixels for top and bottom, and 5% for left and right. And this is how it looks. Great. So we have done everything except the part that which shows our footer options in this way, some kind of a matrix arrangement. This one has a row fashion, and here we have them in a column fashion. So first we have to change them to display in a row fashion. So inside my footer options, I can again apply the flex property using display flex direction to row. Yeah, so we have our elements now displayed in a row fashion, and the problem here is the elements are overflowing outside our container. So basically I want them to wrap inside this container. So again, here we have a flex property called as flex wrap to wrap all the elements which are going beyond our footer section to come in a next row. So I can use this property called as flex wrap. I'll give this a value wrap. Now you can see that all the overflowing elements are arranged in a row manner. Now the next problem is we have uneven number of elements in each row. Let's say for example this row has some 5 elements and this one has 4 elements, but in a mobile view I want only 2 elements in each row. So what I can do is I can define a width for each of these elements. I can say this element, this particular element, should have a width of 50%. So 50% means you can have only 2 elements in a row, right? So I can say all these elements to have a width of 50% in my mobile view code. I'll give this a value of 50%. Now what happens is each of these elements will have a width of 50%. So all the third elements will be pushed to the next row, and we have a matrix wise arrangement here. So you can give a width value to restrict the number of elements in a row. Footer section is ready for mobile view. Let's have a look at the tab view. We have 3 columns here instead of 2. I'll add a comment here for footer section. Now I want 3 elements in a row, right? So I can change the width to 33%, so that for 100% we'll have only 3 elements in a row. Now you can see that when we shift to tab view, we have only 3 columns in a footer section. And again, for our desktop view, we have 4 columns. So I can just copy paste this inside my desktop styling. Now I want 4 elements, right? So I can change the width to 25%. So we'll have 4 elements in a row. Something like this. And that's it, guys. Our footer section is also ready. It's also responsive. Okay, so there are lots of websites where you can deploy your code for free, and one such website is called Netlify. So let me quickly open that, netlify.com, and here you can create an account. Now I already have an account, so I'll just log in. So basically here you can deploy your code in a free domain. So after logging in, you'll have this add new site button. Select deploy manually, and here it says to drag and drop your site output folder here. So basically our project folder is our output folder, this one. So you can drag it and drop it here after saving all the files, and it will take some time. And now it's deployed in this link. You can share this link to anyone whom you want to show your website, or you can also put it in your resume. And yes, that's how you can deploy your website. Thank you guys for joining in. I hope this session invoked some interest in web development.